Now you may recall a year or two ago there was a kosher farm in Iowa there was a ICE immigration customs enforcement incident there. They ended up arresting over 389 workers who were there without documentation. The owner eventually was sentenced to 27 years in prison for massive financial fraud. Among the 389 workers, there were 57 underage workers who were, in the course of their work, exposed to hazardous chemicals, used knives and saws. Some of them were as young as 13, with little safety training, with instances of physical abuse by supervisors, including some instances of sexual abuse. 41 of those people ended up being given visas because they cooperated with investigators and because they were shown to have been physically attacked. If you remember the Jungle, that book that I at least had to read in high school, I recall the book rather vividly describing the nastiness of beef processing, which apparently hit a nerve in the American populace. But the part that didn't really hit a nerve was the author's original point, which was that workers' conditions there were absolutely awful. And things have improved, but not as much as we'd like. Instead of it being poor people in Chicago, it's poor, undocumented immigrants in Florida, North Dakota, and Iowa, throughout the country. The point of this is that the suffering caused by the meat industry isn't limited to animals. I'd much rather that the money that I'm spending to feed myself go to pay people a living, at least a minimum wage, rather than to go to some corporate people perpetuating this cruel system at the expense of their workers. Now, in terms of points, acknowledges that this is suffering, that there is suffering that's caused to animals by factory farming, and this is an important point. I think that even if animal suffering isn't the same as human suffering, and of course it isn't, I wouldn't in any way want to the same extent as PETA and many animal rights activists go in characterizing animal suffering as the same as human suffering. There's a total difference in magnitude, but that doesn't mean that any suffering is conscionable. Unless we have good reason for killing an animal, I really think that we shouldn't do it. And if we're going to do it, we should do it in a much more humane manner than maybe through factory farming. In terms of the physiology argument, yes, of course we are omnivorous animals, but well, cows were never designed by God, by evolution, to consume massive amounts of corn. And being subject to our physical desires certainly isn't something that should cause us to sin by participating in a system that's doing something that is morally wrong. In terms of rights, I agree with my point. Animals don't have rights in the same way that humans have, but that doesn't mean that animal suffering isn't also an evil that should be reduced. Well, what my opponent's argument, I think, lacks is that he fails to address the larger societal implications of the consumption of meat, something that we perpetuate every day when we choose to eat meat, when we pay to buy a hamburger, or when we buy chicken in the grocery store. Something that harms society, harms health, harms the poor, and expands the impact of global warming and other major pollution issues.
I just want to make some references to what the proponent of this particular proposition said in his initial proposition. The idea of extremely cruel, and in, like I said, like in telling the details of the story, there is some value, but we have to differentiate between value and shock value, and I think that is something that we have to remember. And the idea that factory farmed meat and its consumption somehow leads to deforestation and somehow leads to the deforestation of even tropical rainforests and so on does have an element of truth in it, but it may not be wholly true, because there are more number of trees being cut, for instance, in producing paper rather than meat. And I think though it has value, it may not be wholly true. The idea that climate change is caused more because of greenhouse gases which are produced by factories which farm meat rather than the production of automobiles and the consumption of natural fossils somehow seems to me a bit far-fetched. And the analogy between eating meat and smoking cigarettes is not necessarily the right analogy in my opinion, because while meat provides protein, cigarettes do not. The issues of safety, the issues of danger, the issues of sexual abuse are all stark realities in the production of meat, as they are in the production of any other product. And therefore, to talk of these issues as exclusively belonging to the domain of the production of factory farmed meat somehow seems to restrict the debate. The larger societal implications is something that I am also interested in, and for example, the idea that the amount of grain that is used to feed these animals in farms can actually be used to feed the world's poor is a very popular argument. And as I was reflecting on this particular argument, I was thinking the US, like many other nations, or let's say a few other nations to be more precise, dumps tons of wheat in the ocean to regulate prices of food around the world. And therefore, to talk about larger societal implications and to somehow bring in the issue of factory farmed meat to make the point is again a bit far-fetched. Is animal suffering in the production of human food justified? Is one question. The other question is animal suffering for the purpose of human entertainment or the production of better cosmetic products justified? Is another question, and often I think we tend to get confused between these two questions. While I am willing to say yes, that animal suffering in some sense is justified in the production of human food, it is not justified in the production of cosmetic products. Now they are two different things, and while I am willing to say yes to the first one, I am willing to say no, and I will say no to the next one. And what I want to make very clear is that while talking about factory farmed meat, once farming methods that do not involve animal suffering are devised, it is obligatory and ethical and mandatory, in my opinion, to abandon old methods in favor of new, better ones which mitigate or avoid animal suffering altogether. And we must adopt such newer and better ways. But to say that factory farmed meat in itself is unethical, and for us to eat that is also unethical, is a different thing. I may conclude with that at this point.
It's now time for audience participation, so questions will be welcome for the debaters and also any statements that people would like to make. Leading this time will be our moderator for the evening, Katie Chatelain.
Okay, are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, just pick one.
Okay, so Alex, seems to me that the possibly the greatest potential weakness of your argument is that, and John sort of got at this without stating in these words, but is that it proves too much. So if it's never, under any circumstance, ever, quote unquote, ethical to eat factory farm meat, then what about factory made shoes? What about certain other hair products or other things that we know have been in the process, that the very process of bringing those things about have harmed people and is part of a systemic oppression of the poor and so on and so forth. Like, how do you answer that objection?
Yeah, well, it's probably not good to wear a factory farmed, or sorry, a sweatshop produced clothing of any type. I mean, I don't think that it's a good idea to put money in anything that's well contributing to immoral causes.
Opposition, would you like to respond?
Well, I'll just make a very quick point that I already made, and that is these issues, while they are quite relevant to factory farmed meat, are also relevant to other areas. But that doesn't mean that we trivialize this issue. But rather, if we are to talk about larger societal implications, let's think beyond factory farmed meat and also include factory farmed meat in its debate. And just to quickly state again that better ways can be adapted. It doesn't mean that we stick to ways in which animals are treated cruelly. Better ways can be adapted, and they are adapted often.
This is for both of you. What do you define as factory farmed? When does an operation that is raising meat cross over from being non-factory farmed to factory farmed by your definition?
All right. Well, I'll field it first. Honestly, I don't have a specific definition that I'm working with. I believe that there are a number of different definitions of what organic food is, or organic meat as contrasted against factory farmed meat. Largely having to do with the areas, how much space an animal is given, or if it's outside. But this organic label, I can use that as my broad understanding of what isn't factory farmed. But it does also sometimes include animals. Well, say most chickens are raised in cages. However, using an open air area to put hundreds, even thousands of chickens, say in a warehouse that you have actually chickens stacked on top of chickens, can be technically considered organic, but it probably falls into the factory farmed category as well. Maybe you have a better definition.